Thank you very much. It's great to be here. It's rather ominous to have my presentations sponsored by a laundry company. It's not something that politicians are supposed to be involved with in any way or fashion. And I'm sure someone out there is going to talk about spin cycles and other things. It is great to be here, and it was really delighted to get the invitation to speak. I have, after all, been a rising star in 5 decades so far, and I always like to be reminded of the longevity of my contributions. But what I wanted to do this morning, and I really appreciated the chance to hear the other speakers and Deputy Minister LeBlanc and others who've given a bit of an overview of where we are right now. I want to just take us back a bit and talk about some fundamental principles about housing. And then I want to talk a bit about the work that needs to be done for the future. Let me start very personally. I worked as a community worker in North London in England after some time at an English university, and worked a lot with tenants groups and with tenants in London at that time. It's the early 70s. Enormous poverty, great challenges for people in terms of housing, people sleeping in their cars. My first real street introduction to the world of homelessness. My kids were once shocked to see me changing a lock and saying, "Dad, how did you learn how to change a lock on a door?" And I said, "Well, when I was a community worker, we used to change locks on doors all the time because we were trying to get people into housing that was empty." So they said, "Well, do you mean you broke the law?" I said, "Well, I'm not sure about that. And no, I've never actually charged with anything, but it was my pleasure and honor, and I felt my duty to say that if public housing is not being used, then somebody's got to get properly housed, and we've got to do it quickly." And that was my real introduction to what I felt needed to be done. When I came back to Canada and got involved in first of all, federal politics and then provincial politics, I was always one of those people who believed that housing is a right, that the right to be properly housed is as much of a right as the right to health care or the right to education. And I felt then, and I feel now, that housing is not yet seen in terms of public policy as being on a par with education and with health care. And when you look at what's happened to public policy since the 1970s, you can see that housing has become an orphan of public policy. I mean by that whereas with health care we can see which governments are taking responsibility and the funding agreements that are in place, with education, we know which government has the fundamental responsibility at the provincial level and how that funding is in place and how it's dealt with. The taxes that are raised in order to ensure that kids can get to go to school, that we've got places in university and colleges for all of our students who are qualified and who can do the work. And in all those other critical areas of social policy, we can see very clearly that governments are set out as having a responsibility. There's a recognition that the market alone is not going to solve the problem. We recognized in the middle of the 19th century that the market alone was not going to provide for public education. We recognized in the middle of the 20th century that the market alone was not going to provide for health care. And we have a common mission to make sure that in the 21st century, we ensure the principle that the market alone will not solve this problem, and that the public and social element is critical in ensuring housing for all, housing for everyone, that no person is allowed to go without a place they can call their home and their own, and that shelter is a public right that pertains to every citizen in this country. Now, if you look back at the way in which public policy was developed in the United Kingdom, in Canada, in the formation of the welfare state, they always talked about basic pillars: health care, pensions, security as we get older, all the elements. And housing was built into that. Housing was seen as part of that necessary system of supports. But then something else started to happen. And it's been a steady erosion. And it's almost a study in watching how this whole process has eroded. And you know this better than anyone, but let me, for the purposes of just talking this through, take us through the time frame. In the 1970s, early 1970s, the federal government reinvigorated its commitment to the housing sector by introducing supports for co-ops, by reinforcing the need for the federal government to play a leadership role, by the establishment of the Ministry of Urban Affairs and Housing. We had a federal Department of Urban Affairs and Housing. The province did its role, sort of, with respect to housing, particularly for seniors, and was happy to have the federal government play this additional role in looking at what needed to be done. There was Ontario Public Housing, and there was an Ontario Public Responsibility for Housing, but it was clearly shared with the federal government. There was hardly any municipal role at all. And what we've seen since that time has been a steady erosion of support from both the federal government and, historically, the province, to the point now where co-ops are basically being told by this government, and unlike Deputy LeBlanc, I can say whatever the hell I want about any government, it doesn't matter. You know, it's a free country. I can, you know, nobody tells me what to say. So it's critical that we understand how this erosion has taken place. And also critical that we understand that it's not inevitable and it's not an act of natural history. It's a matter of political and social choice. And that's really what I want to focus on in the rest of my remarks, is what are the choices that we need to make today that will reinforce the issue of housing, and why is it that housing has been allowed to become an orphan of public policy? How did governments get away with that? How did that happen? Well, I have a simple formula. I don't think it's simplistic, but it's a simple formula. In public policy, there are we issues and there are us and them issues. Healthcare is a classic we issue. Even the Reform Party believes, or whatever they call themselves today, I think it's the Conservative Party, even the Reform Party believes, isn't prepared to attack the public Medicare system across the country. Now, they're not going to fund it with the vigor that it should be funded. They're going to raise questions about it. They believe that the federal government has a very small role. The provinces should be forced to do it on their own, but still. And the reason for that is we all get old. We all get sick. We all need health care. It's a universal provision. It's a common aspect of the human condition. And so it's a we issue. And it's no surprise that Whereas in the early 90s, healthcare took up about 30% of the provincial budget, and now it's edging up to 40% of the provincial budget. People say we should be doing more about healthcare because they understand that it's something that applies to everybody. When you look at something like social assistance, or, unfortunately, the way it's been, in a sense, stereotyped, housing, it becomes an us and them issue. In other words, housing is something that the government does for somebody else. And this is the problem. We have to understand that every form of housing in the country today is, in a sense, social housing, because every form of housing receives support from the taxpayer. It doesn't, sometimes it's not obvious how that's the case, but the fact is the government of Canada and the government of Ontario subsidize private ownership, because your home, your private home, is exempt from a capital gains tax. And no politician would say, we're going to change that. Everyone agrees that that should be the case. But everyone also has to recognize that when you make that provision, you're essentially saying, we think it's sufficiently important and fair, and we understand this is a very basic investment for working families across the country, and so we're going to give everyone an equal break when they have their own house. And when they sell their house, they don't pay a capital gain on the fact that that's their most significant investment. We accept that. That's a tax-free sale. And you can take that money and either buy another house, or if you're retiring and moving into an apartment or doing something else, then you can keep that. That's part of your nest egg. And that's a very common commitment that we have made together as a country. And as I said, no one on the left, the right, the center, no one's going to turn around and say, well, you know what, we should really start taxing that. It would be a recipe for political defeat, a subject upon which I am something of an expert. After all, how many other premiers have had 12 days a year named after them? Yeah? And even now, hashtag #BobRay48, I know that I'm going to be getting lots of messages from people about various things. As we get closer to the election, the mood on Twitter gets more and more anxious, shall we say. My point is simply this. The first step to changing the debate on housing is to try to show everyone that actually housing is not an us and them issue. Housing is a we issue. Because everyone has a right to housing. No one would disagree with that. And the universal experience has been that the market alone will not answer the needs of a significant portion of the population. Now, the way in which that happens has to evolve and change. No one wants the government of Canada to build a bunch of huge, massive apartments and say, that's where you're living. No one wants to have a landlord which has, several million tenants in it in some kind of hugely bureaucratic system of that nature. The existence of the nonprofit housing movement, the existence of the co-op movement, is a reflection of the fact that people want to fashion their own housing solutions. They don't want the government to physically build it for them. They don't want the government to become their landlord. They want to be able to control that part of their lives, and people are willing to pay for it. but the government has to help. And this is where I think I'm going to speak directly about the opportunities that I hope will come about starting on Tuesday morning. And that is, well, you know, sir, I'm not in a position to make a political speech here today. I don't think that would be fair to the many, many supporters of Mr. Harper that are in the room, and I don't want to engage in that. But I do want to say this. We need a new spirit of partnership and cooperation between every level of government, and we need it. To that, we need to add the powerful co-op and nonprofit movements that are out there today, and we need to add the private sector. We need to add all of those elements to a successful housing strategy which will do the things which Deputy LeBlanc has talked about. A strategy on homelessness requires all hands on deck. We can't just ask the province to do it, or the city to do it, or for one agency or the churches to do it, or others. It requires everyone to be involved and engaged. And it involves as well, and this is a critical issue, it involves targets that tell us what new supply of affordable housing do we need, what is the volume of that supply, and how are we going to make sure that it starts to happen? Why are people homeless? Because they don't have an affordable place to live. It's partly a problem of supply, and it's partly a problem of money for them. People have to have the money to be able to provide for themselves, and there has to be the supply there that's going to ensure that it happens. That's why I'm a strong believer that we need to have solutions which are not afraid to use the market and to talk to the private sector about how they can contribute, and there may well be some tax issues which we have to address. But we also have to recognize, and this is where I believe governments have dropped the ball, governments have to be prepared to invest directly in the supply of affordable housing. And we have to look at the most creative and innovative and cost-effective ways to do that. But we also have to understand that while it might be politically easier, and was at a certain time, politically easier to cut housing, as occurred after '95, than it might be to cut health, we have to start a real dialogue with the public, pointing out that when you cut housing in this way, you are actually increasing health costs. You are increasing the social costs. You are increasing what happens to people when they are forced on the margins. What happens to people when they have nowhere to go, when they have no community they can call their own, when they have nowhere that they can effectively live and celebrate their lives and have friends and neighbors with whom they can celebrate. These are rights that pertain to everyone in this country. And when they are lost, it is a cost that is borne by all of us. We all pay a price for the fact that when we walk down the street, we turn our faces away from the people who are sleeping on the street. We pay a price as a community when there are people that are so marginalized and left out that they're not able to participate in the lives that we all want people to be able to live. And just as important as that, we have to understand that the question of housing is not just about dealing with people who are, quote, the most marginalized. It's about dealing with a huge group in the population who are living in places they can't afford, who are living literally from week to week and month to month and paycheck to paycheck, and who are having to make impossible decisions in their own lives as to whether they pay the rent or buy food. And the slightest dip in the economy, the slightest increase in interest rates, the slightest shift in the prosperity of the country has an immediate impact on housing and housing choices. And so the dialogue with this organization and the dialogue with all the organizations across the country has to start very soon, because time's a wasting in terms of what's happening on the housing front. And I think as we look at it, we can't roll a clock back and say we've got to change and go back to the way it was in 1965 or the way it was in 1955 or the role that one government or another played. No, we've got to create another table in which we say, okay, how are we going to do this? And let me just close with the thought that it really does start with this critical question. Do we agree that there is a right to housing in this country? Yes or no? And if we do, at that point, we have to say, well, then what are we going to do to make sure it happens? Understanding that every level of government has to be involved and engaged. So with those words, I want to express my thanks to you for giving me a chance to speak. You'll appreciate that it's been a long time since I've spoken to this many people in a room, and it's a very nice feeling to be able to do it once again. Thank you very much. And whatever else you do, please vote on Monday. Vote before the Blue Jays game. Get your vote in early. I won't say vote early and often. That's such an old cliche. I would never do that. But I would say to all of you, please make sure you vote. Your vote is important. Your engagement is important. Your involvement is important. Don't leave it up to somebody else. Thank you all very much. Appreciate it.